I wanted to start with a quote from somebody to help you relax. And this quote relates to what I'm going to talk about. The seed of suffering in you may be strong, but don't wait until you have no more suffering before allowing yourself to be happy. That was Thich Nhat Hanh who said that. And I'm sure everyone is going to interpret that in their own way, depending on where you're at in your life right now. For me, it relates to this body of work that I started last year. So now I'm going to stand up. I started this work in March of last year, a year into the pandemic, and I had just moved to a new studio. And at that time, March of last year, the way I saw the world, so many people were depressed and suffering and tired and weary and angry, and depending on what part of the pandemic was affecting them and what part of politics and the environment and social issues were affecting them, everyone was in a different place. When I walked into my studio, I didn't relate to that anymore. And I've been a very compassionate person, and outside the studio, you know, I could feel all that, and I had my own things to deal with, but when I walked in that studio, it wasn't there anymore, and I wanted to try to pass that feeling on to other people through the work. And so I want to talk about this body of work that started last March until early this year, and what's the same about this work as my past shows with Gundi since 2016, and the things that are different. And what I just talked about of wanting to pass on that feeling I got when I was in my studio, that's a big difference, because I have never had a strong intent in my work before. Personal intentions in my work to experiment and have a good time and like what I was doing and learn new things, but I didn't have an intent specifically related to what was going to happen after the work was out, and this time I did, so that's a big difference. And the title, A Glimpse of Infinity, I describe the feeling in the studio as timeless and expansive and light, and that's how I define infinity in my philosophical terms, not in mathematical terms necessarily, you know, but and the term and glimpse, a glimpse of infinity, is a nod to one of my favorite abstract expressionists, Willem de Kooning. In an interview, probably many of you've heard it, he called himself a slipping glimpser. I won't go into that, but I borrowed that. But I love that word glimpse, because I can't really convey all of my feelings to you, but I can try to give you a glimpse of the feeling that I get, the joy and the shutting out of the world. I didn't even have to shut it out, it's just that's the way it happens. So now I need to look at my notes. Let's see. Oh, some of the other things that are the same in this work to all my work in the past is the color, the dense color, and I'm never really very interested in subtle gradations of color and value and tone. I just like dense, bright color. So I always use that pretty much from the very beginning. Another thing is texture is important to me, because I feel like texture carries memory. It carries memory of touch and what I was doing with the work. And one way that I get texture, and I always have, is to work on pieces that have been in the studio for years, either finished pieces or unfinished pieces. And as a side note, that's like the hardest part of my process, because I like to do something, work on it, get it done. And to have these canvases in the studio for years, it just drives me crazy. But it's part of my process, and that's what works for me. So that's the same, the texture and the color. And let's see, what's different? The structure, the intentions, and the control. And also what's different is I consider this work more abstract than non-representational. All my work in the past, I made a conscious effort to obliterate anything that reminded me of anything. if I saw a face, or if I saw something outside, or if I saw anything, I just had to get rid of it. I couldn't live with it. But this work, and I think that's a result of wanting to convey something to others, I consider it abstract. I've abstracted from, I mean, everything to me looks familiar. I don't know if it looks familiar to you, but it does to me. And what it looks like is a lot is textiles. So let's see, the color part of it, about 2 years ago, it started in my mind. I wanted to lighten my palette. And so I started experimenting with new pigments and mixtures of paint. And it took me about 1.5 to 2 years to figure out which ones I wanted to keep and which ones I wanted to eliminate. And that doesn't mean from now until forever. That meant for the next body of work I was going to do. And one way I lightened the palette was eliminating the earth pigments. I didn't, except for in that one I have earth pigments, but there isn't any earth pigments in any other ones of these. That was, let's see, that was one thing with the color. Also, about 1.5 years ago, I started having these visions in my mind of blocks of color. And anyone who knows my work from the past knows I don't usually paint blocks of color. Sometimes a piece or here and there will come out like that, but so they stayed in my mind for a long time. I said, what are these blocks of color? I went to the library and I thought, well, the only thing I can think of with blocks of color is textiles. So I got a couple books out there, 2, maybe 3, but no more than 3. And I started looking at American textile art. It was mostly American. And I was seeing my blocks of color. I was seeing quilts, and I was seeing, wall hangings and weavings. And I thought, well, that's good, that's helpful. So I pulled out these old paintings, and I started painting, and I started with some blocks of color, and it just wasn't like, this has nothing to do with the way I feel. This has nothing to do with joy and infinity and timelessness and expansiveness. So I had my music on, and I wanted to tell you what music, when I listen to music in the studio, I usually, and I'm working on paintings, I have to keep the same genre, because if I have something on like a classical radio station and they're playing some nice Brahms or whatever they're playing, or maybe they're playing Mozart, and all of a sudden there's a march and some movie music, and my painting goes all over the place. So this time, for this body of work, I listened to mainly 2 albums and part of another one, and they were both jazz, pretty mellow jazz. George Duke and Chris Bodie, and the Chris Bodie album was, I wrote it down because I know I wouldn't remember. Let's see. Not that you should listen to it, but it affects the mark making mostly. George Duke album was After Hours, and Chris Bodie was Slowing Down the World. I also listened to a little bit of Van Morrison, and so that's the music that was on. And so I had these color blocks, they weren't working, and I have this music, and I start my mark making a lot with my hands, painting knives, rags. I hardly ever use brushes. I like to be very direct. I like the human touch in the work. I like to keep the humanness in the work, So that's what I started to do, and then I realized after a couple paintings I had these kind of patterns starting. I said, well, these patterns serve my intention to convey kind of an infiniteness, because pattern, as an element of design, it implies when our brains see it that something's going on beyond what's directly in front of us. This goes on, doesn't it? Pattern, that's what pattern does. It's pretty simple. So, and normally in the past, something like that, I would have said, no, I can't have this. Get rid of it. But this time, it said, this is going to convey what I want to convey. So let's see. I think that's pretty much about it. I thought I might talk about a few individual ones. Oh, I did a post, some things occurred to me after the work was done. Like, I didn't intend to have these patterns. Another thing I didn't intend was, to me, I see a lot of indigenous culture type of pattern work, and like I see like Scandinavian, maybe African, maybe South American, maybe like this one reminds me of the Australian Aboriginal work. none of that was intentional. That wasn't in the books I looked at. So I also was like, where is this coming from? And I realized that some of it had come from the environment I grew up in when I was young, from the patterns of my mother's culture, Pennsylvania Dutch. I mean, most people probably think of hex signs, but in the home, pattern was what brightened up our lives. I had some pretty traumatic years when I was young, but before those traumatic years, I had some really good ones when I was really young. And we always had a bright pattern in our home, and my father, he's an Italian creative man, he painted, and he was always into really bright colors, and those joyful things gave me strength during the hard times. And I didn't know that until afterwards, like, wow, all these years of studying painting and practicing, and I kind of buried that part of the good part of my childhood, But here it came out, and I hope that I conveyed what I wanted to convey. I mean, it may not seem like infinity to you, but it does to me.